Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Divorce Differently podcast. Today's another episode in our special series, Debunking Divorce Myths with Gilson Gray, where we unpack some of the most common misconceptions people have about divorce in England and Wales. So in this episode, we're looking at the belief that we hear surprisingly often, that there's no point getting a prenup because English courts don't really uphold them anyway. This idea circulates widely, and actually, I hear it a lot from clients. We see it in the media, sometimes even in casual legal conversations. And so it leads people to dismiss prenups because they don't really understand how they work in practice. In this episode, we're going to explore where this idea comes from and what reality truly looks like on the ground when it comes to prenups in England and Wales. My guest today is Linda Pope. Linda is a partner in Gilson Gray's family law team, and she advises her clients in divorce, separation, and private law children cases. Based in the London office, Linda has extensive experience of handling high-value financial claims with international multi-jurisdictional issues, family businesses, and trusts, as well as representing clients with limited assets where a novel solution is required. Linda, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation.
Thank you, Chloe, for inviting me to join the conversation.
So if we look back, I guess there must be a historical reason why that myth exists. What is the history behind this idea that prenups have no value in England and Wales?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I probably have this conversation every time I'm instructed by someone on or initial conversation about a prenuptial agreement. So I think there's a myth that it's only for the ultra wealthy.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's how it originated, that, you know, you had these probably families who had these kind of long-standing family wealth, which they wanted to protect just in case the marriage broke down. So that's where it really started. And so I think the ordinary person thinks, well, I'm not ultra wealthy, so I don't need one. But the reality is that modern prenuptial agreements actually help couples of all income levels decide how to protect assets that they're bringing into the relationship, how debts are handled, and also to manage, lots of people may have inheritances or they may have family wealth, not obviously ultra wealthy, but just to protect how that is dealt with if the relationship was broken down. So that's one myth.
And so why is it that people think that they're worthless? Has there been a history of the courts not actually upholding them?
No, I would say that since, and we're probably going to talk about it later, there was a major Supreme Court decision in 2010, which was the Radmacher case. And I think that kind of set the benchmark about how the courts now approach prenuptial agreements in our modern age. And essentially what that case established was kind of like a three-step approach to prenuptial agreements, which essentially full financial disclosure, no duress, getting legal advice, and essentially if those kind of three things are prevalent when the couples are deciding on having a prenuptial agreement and then looking at it whether it should be upheld in the event of the relationship breaking down. I think if those three things are in place, and there are other things the court looks at, then it's more likely than not that it will be upheld.
Okay, so it's not that they have no value, it's just that there's rules around them being recognized and enforced. They have to basically have been entered into in a fair context, which is why they want to see the financial disclosure and legal advice.
Yeah. I mean, I've had people who've come to me, an initial consultation. Well, I want a prenuptial agreement, but I don't want him or her to get anything. Well, that's not going to work. you know.
Yeah.
So if if you're starting at that premise, then and the relationship does break down, then it's highly unlikely that the prenuptial agreement that you entered into is not going to be upheld.
Yeah. So I think that's probably also one of the elements that leads to people thinking that their prenup isn't going to be worth much, is because there were in the historically some people who were making prenups on agreements that were completely unfair, basically. And so the
Yeah.
court will still assess whether the prenup is fair effectively. They're not going to just apply it blindly because the parties agreed and signed on the dotted line. Is that right?
Yes, yes, and essentially yes, and also it needs to meet needs. So it needs to meet the needs of obviously your ex-spouse and
Hmm.
also the needs of any children as well.
Yes.
So you're quite right; they're just not going to blindly sign off. But if at the time that the parties are getting divorced, the
Hmm.
agreement is fair and it meets the needs of that spouse and children, then it more than
Yeah.
likely it will be upheld.
Yeah. And so that, I guess in that sense, it's very different. I mean, I work with a lot of clients from France where the equivalent of a prenup is actually applied to the letter. It's very black and white.
Mm,
And so that,
yeah.
that's also part of, I guess, this idea that in England it's more discretionary. It's not going to be applied as any contract would be, just saying this is what you agreed to, this is how we apply it.
Yeah, and there is an element of kind of crystal ball gazing because,
Hmm.
you know, a couple that gets married, who got married maybe 10 years ago, who knows what their circumstances will be, you know, if they were to divorce 10 years later, 15 years later,
Yeah.
which is the reason why we also, as professionals, recommend a review clause
Hmm.
to take into account, you know, changes in life, in circumstances. And also, many prenuptial agreements would have things in there that to kind of like prompt a review. For
Yes.
example, if somebody has been out of work for say 12 months or more, maybe due to ill health, any children, inheritances as
Yes, I
well.
would imagine that
Although
makes sense.
inheritances are generally not matrimonial assets, but you know, if that inheritance has been used to buy a matrimonial property, or if the
Mm.
couple have been living off that money, then you're having a different discussion. So
Yeah.
I think one of the things with couples who enter prenuptial agreements when they get married, they just think, right, we've got the prenuptial agreement, that's it, it's in the drawer, don't need to
Yes.
look at it. But we very much build into it review clauses. So maybe
Yes.
after 5 years, 7 years, if this happens, that happens. It's so important to review in the change in your circumstances, in your relationship and life.
And does that help ultimately with enforcing those if there were to be a divorce at the end of it all? The fact that the prenup's been reviewed recently is, I would imagine, a factor there.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I've always said to clients that, you know, um, yes, you have a prenuptial agreement, and there, you know, there's always the potential risk that it might not be upheld,
Hmm.
but you should think about, certainly if there is a significant life change, that you enter into a postnuptial agreement. And
Yeah.
that tends to carry a bit more weight because you don't have the arguments about duress,
Yes.
because you're already married.
Yeah.
So, you know, that person could say, no, I'm not signing it.
Yeah.
So I think the main thing is, like your wedding album, you don't put it in a, you put it in a drawer and you don't look at it, or you maybe look at it once a year on your anniversary. I
Yes.
think with a prenuptial agreement, it's important, if there's a significant life change, that you look at reviewing it and having a new agreement, which essentially would be a postnuptial agreement,
Yeah.
which tends to carry a bit more weight because you don't have the arguments, as I said, about duress,
Yeah.
um, and non-transparency, because you would have thought by, the couple would know different things in life, money, that sort of thing. Yeah.
And I guess another factor to flag in terms of major life changes would be an international move, because then you're going to have to make sure that that prenup is valid in whatever country you're going to. So that's often an important
Yeah,
intersection.
100%. So another thing we advise clients is, if they are proposing to move, so for example, if one of the parties has, has a job which is international and they move
Yeah.
every couple of years, is to take advice from a lawyer in that jurisdiction. And in fact, it's reminded me that many years ago, I did a prenuptial agreement for a couple who said that it was very likely that for husband's job, they would be
Yeah.
moving to another country. And I can't remember what country it was. And so I said it was important that they got some advice now about how the prenuptial agreement that they were executing in England and Wales would be viewed
Yeah.
in that jurisdiction. And I think, if memory serves me correct, there was a few emails between myself and their lawyer in that jurisdiction, just to put something in place to say essentially that the agreement would be recognised in that jurisdiction.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a common mistake people make actually.
Yeah.
When they move abroad, they think their prenup's just coming with them, and not every country applies them in the same way. So is it fair to say that in England a prenup is not actually binding? It's just highly persuasive, or is there a way of making it bulletproof?
Um, oh, that's a good question. I think that since 2010 and the Supreme Court decision in the Radmacher case, I think that you could say that more likely than not, a prenuptial agreement will be upheld if it meets the needs of, I suppose, the less economically wealthy individual.
Yeah.
It won't if it doesn't meet their needs. But what we've been seeing in the cases coming out of the courts is that with prenuptial agreements, the courts are now, since that case,
Yeah.
they're respecting more the autonomy of the couple in terms of
Okay.
how they want to organize their finances and what happens if the marriage was to break down.
Yeah.
So the court in some cases will take the view, well, the parties both had there was full financial disclosure, the parties both had were separately represented. There was sufficient proximity between the date the agreement was signed and the wedding, so there's no reason why the agreement should be upheld. So it's probably only in extreme circumstances that a court would say, well, no, we are invading what the autonomy of the parties who made that agreement at the time, and they were happy with
Yeah.
the agreement
Yeah.
at
They
the
signed it.
time. It also, the case of Radmacher also overturned this view or long time held view
Yeah.
that the parties shouldn't enter into an agreement to predetermine what happens at the end of a marriage. So
Okay.
again, it's this whole thing about, what you choose to do in terms
Yeah.
of how your relationship ends. Why should the court invade that decision? And the other thing is that it was bringing the UK into line with what happens in a lot of other jurisdictions. I
Yeah.
mean, you mentioned in France, where, if that's what you agree, that's what happens.
Mhm.
And certainly in the Americas, South Africa. So really, it was bringing us into line with what happens, because probably we were one of the very few jurisdictions that didn't have, or where prenuptial agreements were not legally binding.
Yeah. That makes
Um,
sense.
I think the other thing was, and I mentioned earlier, it was about the three-step test in whether
Yes.
an agreement was fair, and it's whether it's freely entered into, if there's full understanding. I mean, there are cases where one party may not understand the terms and the
Mhm.
implications of the agreement, and they can't afford to get legal advice. I mean, many times when I'm doing prenuptial agreements, and the party who wants the prenuptial agreement, they will generally pay for the other party to get legal advice. And I
Which
think
is
that's
fair.
money
Yeah.
well spent. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's money
Agreed.
well spent, because it will be recorded in the agreement that they got legal advice from X lawyer, and also they would sign the certificate. So to me, that's money well spent, and they can't then come back later and say, well, I didn't understand it. Well,
Yes.
you had legal advice. So
Yeah.
if your lawyer understood it, then you should as well. And then I think the other thing, which is probably a concept that some people may not get, is fairness at the time of the divorce, not necessarily
Yes.
fairness when you enter the agreement.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you have a couple who at the start of their marriage, dual income, but invariably the woman takes a career break, so
Yeah.
she's not earning as much as husband at the time of the divorce. You can't say, well, in the agreement it said you're not getting any spousal maintenance.
Yeah.
And she's thinking, well, I've been out of the workplace for 5 years. It's not like I can get back into a job tomorrow. And so
Yeah.
I may need some financial support from my spouse until I get back on my feet. So the
Yeah.
court will look at the circumstances at the time of the divorce, not necessarily 100% on what the circumstances of the couple was when they entered into the agreement. So essentially, though, that's the three-step approach the courts now take to prenuptial agreements, which generally makes them fairer and more
Yeah.
likely to be upheld.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Just thinking, it's something that came to mind as you were speaking is also looking at the children's side of things. Can
Yes.
prenups dictate who's going to keep the kids if they have kids, even at a time where they might not even have the children yet? Can that be covered, or are prenups entirely for the finances?
It's generally for the finances,
Mhm.
but it will include financial provision for any
Okay.
children.
Yeah.
So examples are like housing funds.
Mhm.
So if the children will live predominantly with, and it's not being sexist, it's just that women tend to be primary carers of children, although it's moving more to kind of 50-50.
Mhm.
Um, that if the mum is going to be the primary carer, then it may be that she needs a slightly larger housing fund,
Mhm.
because the children will live with her, and that will be their
Yeah.
predominant
Yeah.
home. um, it may include things about payments for children, or
Mhm.
although in the UK, the court doesn't have jurisdiction to deal with child
Yeah.
maintenance. It's the child maintenance service, but there's no reason why the prenuptial agreement can't say, well, you will get X lump sum for the children, or this is what will be paid for the children, or school fees, or
Yeah.
something like that. But if not, then it would be a separate agreement. So it doesn't
Okay.
cover things like who the children live with and how much time they spend with each parent. But again, when a marriage breaks down, the court's primary concern is obviously for the welfare of the children.
Yes.
And so they will look at that in terms of the fairness of the agreement. So if one party, they are economically weaker, so they need a bit more money or a bit more financial support because they will have the children for most of the time, or even if it's 50-50,
Yeah.
to ensure that when the children are with that parent, they don't feel like, well, with mum, I'm living in the horrible house,
Yeah.
and we can't get what we need, but when we go to dad, it's amazing, we have this
Mm.
amazing life. It's about trying to have fairness, so the children have two nice homes with both their parents.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I guess for those who are listening and who are thinking, do I need a prenup? Yeah, when do you think prenups are particularly valuable? Do you think that they should be a systematic endeavor in every marriage, or are there specific contexts where you would really flag them as almost essential?
Well, it's funny. I was having a chat with my trainee about this a couple of months ago, and I said I view prenuptial agreements like insurance policies. You wouldn't get into a car knowing it didn't have insurance.
Yeah,
So I always think that with prenuptial agreements, I suppose essentially if you've got something to lose, it's worth having a prenuptial agreement.
yeah,
So I don't think it's necessary to say, oh, well, if it's your first marriage or whatever, that means you don't need a prenuptial agreement. But as I said, if you've got something to lose, so if you're bringing in a property, many
hmm,
people are getting married a bit later in life, so they
yeah,
may have property, assets, savings, that sort of thing. It may be one party has is particularly wealthy in terms of their income. They earn a
yeah,
lot of money. Um, I think certainly it's important to have a prenuptial agreement to protect those assets.
yeah,
And it also gives certainty to both parties. So it gives certainty to the economically stronger party that effectively this is what I would have to part with if
yeah,
the relationship broke down. But similarly, for the party who is economically weaker, they
mhm,
know that this is the baseline in terms of what
yeah,
I would receive. So it gives certainty to both parties. So I just think that it's a discussion you should have maybe shortly before or maybe shortly after you'll come off the high of getting engaged,
yeah,
and it's a discussion to have. I know some people think it's unromantic and it shows distrust, but I think it's a sensible, mature conversation to have with your spouse about, what's going to happen, to how we're going to divide our finances if in the unlikely event our relationship doesn't work out.
yeah. And I think, if you look at the statistics with 42% of marriages ending in divorce, even if nobody ever enters a marriage thinking about divorce and hoping for it, it is a reality that it can happen. And as you
Yeah,
say, having
yes.
that certainty up front. And I assume there's also a knock-on effect in terms of less conflict later on when they come to divorce, if they get to that stage. Because again, things have been already discussed and clarified, so expectations are set.
Yes. Yeah. And as I said, particularly for the party who is economically weaker, if, for example, the prenup says, well, you're going to get this house or this housing fund. So, well, this is what I'm going to get on
Yeah,
the marriage breaking down. And this is what I will be able to spend that money on to buy a property. So it does provide that certainty that, if it doesn't work out, I know what I'm going to get.
yeah,
And it reduces, as I said, the stress and conflict at the if the marriage breaks down.
yeah.
And I mean, the thing is, unfortunately, getting divorced is one of the top three stressors, isn't it? When you look
It
at,
is. Yeah.
what the stress that people experience in life, it's bereavement,
I
divorce, and I
think
can't
I
remember
think
what the other
divorce
one
is
is.
the next one, actually,
Yes,
right after the
yes,
loss of a spouse.
yeah, and I think that anything that you can have in place to minimize that stress has to be a good thing.
Great, great. So I'm going to put your contact details in the notes for the episode. So if anybody needs a prenup, even a postnup, and is just realizing that they haven't really dotted the I's and crossed the T's, definitely reach out to Linda to have that conversation, to get that support, to make sure that agreement is follows the rules from Radmacher and the expectations from the court, so that it has a good chance of being upheld at the other end. Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Thank you.